Hello and welcome to our June 3rd Tuesday at 3 series event, a small business compliance primer. I'm Allen Falcon, CEO of Cumulus Global, and I want to take a moment to thank you for taking time out of your busy day and week to either be joining us here live on the third Tuesday at 3 p.m. or viewing or listening to this recording on demand at some point in the future. We appreciate your interest in the topics, and as always, feel free to contact us if there's something we can do to help or there's a topic you'd like to see us cover. As we jump into the content today, a couple of reminders that about the session, that the audio is muted. So at any point in time, if you have a question or a comment, the best way is to look along the top or right side of your screen, find that icon for the questions window, open it up. We have plenty of time at the end, and I'll stay on the line as needed for Q&A as well. As with all of our live online events, we record the session. It generally takes us about less than 24 hours to get things filtered, processed, and posted. Once it's up there, we'll send you an email giving you a link. Feel free to share with your colleagues. And a reminder that our 3 series is one of many resources in our resource center, including an ever-growing library of eBooks and white papers, our relatively new weekly bulletins covering Microsoft Cloud every Monday and Google Workspace every Wednesday. Each of those messages takes 3 to 5 key items that we think would be relevant to you as our clients or people interested in the type of services or just being small entities, small and mid-sized entities interested in cloud computing as far as what's happening in those two ecosystems. And periodically, we'll offer a Coffee and Cloud series. Those are fast web events, typically run 10 to 15 minutes. And if you attend it live or watch the recording, and you like coffee, at your option, we'll send you a physical Starbucks or Dunkin' coffee card. And so you'll get a cup, maybe even 2 on us. That, in addition to our blog, our events calendar, and our monthly newsletter, are all available in the Resource Center. So take a moment, visit the website, and check that out. Enough of the commercial. Let's start and jump right into compliance. And as a working definition, we're going to define compliance as a validated adherence to a defined set of requirements or guidelines. And the reason we choose this as a good working definition is it's not saying, hey, you have the pieces in place. It's saying that it's not only been validated, that you have the pieces in place, but that you're adhering to those standards, the requirements or guidelines that you're claiming compliance with, meaning you have some form of monitoring and reporting, and preferably even a mitigation strategy should deviations happen. And when we're talking about compliance at the center, obviously we're referring to security, but in the broadest sense of the word for our businesses. So this really is not just a technology issue. It truly is a business issue, and really led by the need for better cybersecurity and overall information privacy. Security is not just the realm of your techie people. It's now a business driver that's going to impact your relationships with customers, with vendors, even potentially with regulators and leadership in your industry. And so that's why we take this very broad view of it. So when we talk about compliance sources, what are those sources, right? And some people say, oh, you've got the reference architectures, right? NIST 2.0 is a framework that helps you. If you follow it and you adhere to it, then you're secure and you're compliant. CIS is another organization that is more of a control-based model. And of course, you have ISO 27001, which are security standards. And ISO, as with all ISO, it's not just policy and procedure, it's implementation, supporting technology, monitoring, management, validation. And in all of these frameworks, there's various degrees of third-party certification services. Okay, but we really see on a very business level the demand for compliance and the incentive to identify what standards and what regulatory requirements and what agency level requirements, any laws you should be complying to, and being able to document and prove your compliance. That's really being driven at a business level from a couple of different sources. The first is legal, and that specific requirements are now being codified into law. And we've all heard of HIPAA. Most of us have probably run into FedRAMP, which is started in the DoD. It's now a broader federal set of security requirements in order to supply certain types of products, services, technology to the government. Sarbanes-Oxley, well, it's a financial management tool. Instead of regulations, part of it is risk mitigation, and so cybersecurity and other IT security, even physical security, comes into play there. FERPA is one of, it's the Federal Education Record Protection Act. This is it really applies to school districts and how you keep it. And these are just examples at the federal level. Even broader now, you have GDPR, which is the EU's General Data Protection Regulation. And, well, you say, well, I'm a US-based company. That's fine. GDPR applies to you if you have a customer who's a resident of the EU. Similarly, in California, you have the California Consumer Protection Act, or CCPA. You also have the California CPRA, which deals specifically with privacy. In fact, right now, there are 20 plus states that have implemented or are close to passing state-level regulations on information privacy, cybersecurity, and other forms of information protection. And the challenge for us at businesses, you get these legal requirements coming from everywhere. And particularly with the state rules now, one of the complexities is the state law isn't based on where you're located or where you do business or where you might have nexus because you have a facility or employees. It is based on your customer. So if you have customers in California, you can be held liable under CCPA and CPRA. If you have customers in Massachusetts, Massachusetts has fairly strict personally identifiable information or PII protection rules and regulations. You can be held accountable under those laws as well. And so it's really creating a minefield for small businesses on what do I need to do. And it's really, how much do I need to do? How much should I do? Because for small, mid-sized organizations, budget is an issue. And you can't necessarily afford to do everything. And from a business perspective and even a risk mitigation, you probably don't need to do everything. But there's certain things you're going to need to have in place and you're going to want to have in place, particularly as you identify where you need to be able to document and prove your compliance. The second source is the regulatory source. And these are rules established within the jurisdiction of agencies. We'll focus federal, but there can be state agencies that do specific rules as well. So, for example, in some states, you can have state chartered banks that do not have to be federally chartered. The chartering agency and the oversight agencies for those state chartered banks are at the state level. They'll define your cybersecurity rules and your other security requirements. Some of the common ones are SEC 17, HIT, which is short for high tech standards, that relates to HIPAA and other personal protections. The FTC now is promulgating safeguard rules for any company that comes under FTC jurisdiction. We're seeing this with other industries as well. We see it with Department of Agriculture. Basically, you name it, a federal department or agency that has regulatory oversight, cybersecurity, and security more general, and information protection is weaving into those existing regulations. The third main source is industries, right? And so for financial investment advisors, FINRA has their own set of rules. If you're a member of FINRA, if you're certified by FINRA, you need to follow them. SOC is, or SOC as it's known, and you probably hear a lot about SOC Type 1, Type 2 compliance that gets promoted. That actually came out of the AICPA, and so the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, and it's because it's really defining a set of processes and controls and validation that you're following those processes. PCI DSS, that's the security requirement that comes out of the payment card industry, right? So credit and debit card companies got together and said, we're gonna regulate our own industry so that we don't have the government making those decisions for us. Now we're starting to see the American Bar Association weaving security and privacy requirements into their ethics rules. We're seeing that at the state level. We see it within the CPA licensing agencies. and the licensing agencies for other professionals. The IRS has now published requirements for people who are authorized to represent clients before that agency, as well as for tax preparers and other folks who might interact with the agency on an individual or a company's behalf. And so we're seeing a large push around cybersecurity, personal information protection, information privacy. And it's not just, coming from us, the tech advisors, trying to sell you something. It's happening legal, regulatory, in industry, right? And so that's where the source is coming. And when we talk about compliance, a lot of people say, "Oh, I need to encrypt emails, or I need to have, archive and e-discovery in place, or I need to have, advanced threat protection for email and, next gen level endpoint protection, or I should be web filtering." That's only part of it, right? When we look at the compliance, a horrible, childish analogy, but I'll use it here. It's colorful. I found a nice colorful image for the slide, but it's the three-legged stool again. The first leg is actually policies. And that's where you define your commitment to compliance, the direction and how you're going to attain compliance, and what standards what framework you're going to use as your benchmark, and what standards, whether it's industry, regulatory, or legal, that you need to be able to document and prove your compliance with. And part of that policy is also direction for staff on what they're allowed and not allowed to do, and how they work within the policies, and should include consequences for incidental as well as deliberate violation of those policies. The second leg of the stool is the process. This is where you implement workflows that foster security and help build that culture of security. This is where the technology piece comes in, for all the technology components and services you're going to use to create the secure environment, to monitor it, to manage it, to report on it. And it's also where your human factors come in. This is where it's important that you realize that, your employees, your contractors need to understand your compliance requirements as a business, and what that means for them and how they do their jobs on a day-to-day basis, right? And because of that, there's an education, there's a training, there's a reinforcement, and ideally a little bit of random testing to make sure people get it and they're behaving in a way that helps instead of hurts with the security problem. And the third leg is proof, right? Okay, you've got policies in place, you put in the processes. Okay, are you following it? What happens if someone makes a mistake? What happens if someone deliberately deviates from the policies? So here's, you've got to document what's in place. You have to, how it's being used, report on it. You should be monitoring compliance and hopefully identifying deviations or risks of deviation, and have procedures in place to mitigate that risk if and when a deviation occurs. Okay, without all three legs to the stool, you really don't have good cybersecurity in place or security in place, and you're really not compliant. All of the regulations include a component, and the component that's most often neglected or forgotten about, or done after the fact as an afterthought, is that proof. Right? You need all three pieces in order to attain that compliance for the various standards, regulations, and laws that you need to comply with. And so we talk about, the sources of compliance. We've talked about the components. Now what are the drivers, right? I've already talked quite a bit about the government, right? Passing laws at the federal and state level. Agencies who have the authority to create regulations are writing regulations around security. Some of those directly tied to legislation, some of those not as directly, but the agencies are looking to establish best practices. And the problem is this all flows down to you as the small business. The area we haven't talked about much, but is just as important right now, is your supply chain. And the supply chain that you're part of. And so when we look, we've gotten calls from companies that we support, who want to know our level of compliance in certain specific areas, because they're being held to that standard, and for them to comply, it relies on ours. So when you think about your supply chain, think about your customers or the businesses you're selling products and service to. Their compliance relies on yours. Now, depending on the industry you're in, that might be pretty indirect. For other industries, it can be exceedingly direct and not derivative at all. And it's not just you and your customers, it's your vendors and your partners who are providing you with components of what you do or products and services that you're using. Your compliance relies on theirs. And it's not uncommon when companies get security questionnaires through the supply chain that the questions are about, hey, tell us about your business, and now tell us about how well you understand the compliance and the risk of your supply chain. Because your customer is going to start to worry about whether or not your suppliers are going to impact your ability to service them. And that's not surprising to anyone, I hope, that the supply chain's more integrated and the knowledge about who's doing what, why, and how well is a bit more integrated. And so the supply chain fundamentally is risk management, right? It's companies looking to comply themselves, having to impose things, up and down their supply chain to make that happen, but also they're looking to mitigate their own risk for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is insurance, because insurance is all about risk management and loss prevention. And again, when cyber insurance first came out, keep in mind that insurance is priced and modeled and structured based on data, on actuarial data. So when cyber insurance first came out, it was relatively cheap. Security questionnaires were short. I remember one-page forms with 10 to 15 questions, very high level. Policies were issued, and then boom, claims were made. And insurance companies learned very quickly how to identify, assess, quantify, measure, and charge for risk. And so we've seen a couple of iterations in cyber insurance that really, long and the short of it, are driving compliance requirements. Because the insurance companies for a while were saying, well, do you have X technology or X protection? And if you didn't, they'd say, well, we're going to reject you and deny you coverage, or you need to implement this specific technology to provide that capability. That was damaging for small businesses in particular, because oftentimes that technology wasn't appropriately sized or priced for small business, where other alternatives would be just as effective, but not nearly as costly. It was also flawed because it was looking at point technologies and point solutions. And so now insurance companies are saying, oh, you're in X industry and X location. Show us how you comply with these 2, 8, 20, however many compliance requirements, which can be industry, regulatory, or legal. And they're still going to ask you about your supply chain and your best practices and your 3 legs of the stool. And so we see the driver of how compliance is becoming a bigger issue coming from multiple sources. So all of this creates a lot of confusion, right? As I mentioned, government regulation, your chances are you fall under multiple agency jurisdictions. 18 states have privacy laws, several more expected to pass very shortly. Government contract requirements for government generally create a baseline for government regulations. So FedRAMP, which had a low and a high and was promoted by the DoD for DoD work, is now being adopted as the de facto standard for nearly every federal government agency, and even some states are starting to say, if someone's FedRAMP high compliant, we know what that means. That's how we'll interact with them. GDPR, even though it's out of the EU, given the size of that market, has become the standard for personal information protection. The closest one, regulation we have in the US is California's CCPA. Again, even as other states have privacy laws, if you've got customers in California and you're CCPA compliant, chances are you're compliant with every other state level privacy and security law or regulation. We also see government regulation looking at it from a number of perspectives: protection for consumers, protection for individuals who may or may not be consumers of yours or customers of yours, as well as protecting organizations. Mix in the industry regulations. We talked about SOC and PCI. I'll throw in another one. SAE is the automotive standards regulatory, and you've probably seen the SAE standard on the can of motor oil that you buy or the jug of motor oil you buy. They're now imposing cybersecurity requirements on manufacturers of automobiles to making sure that the systems in the cars themselves are safe. And as I mentioned earlier, bar associations for legal, CPA associations for CPAs, etc. We're seeing a lot of industry and professional standard organizations promulgating their own industry regulations. And I started at the beginning and talked about, we have dueling reference standards, NIST 2.0, CIS, and ISO. Which one you pick will depend on the markets you're in. Oftentimes, if you need to be FedRAMP high because if you work for the federal government, chances are NIST 2.0 is going to be your best reference standard because FedRAMP references the NIST standards when it talks about compliance and things you need to do. ISO is predominant, culturally within certain types of manufacturing, distribution, and service businesses. In those industries, your customers might be looking for you to have that ISO 27001 certification in the cybersecurity. For a lot of small businesses, the CIS standard, it's a bit simpler. It's more operation and control oriented, which for small mid-sized businesses makes it easier to understand and to implement compliant solutions because it feels a bit more tactical in its approach. And it is widely recognized and accepted by general business liability and cyber insurance underwriters. So you have options there to consider as well. So where do you begin, right? And you begin with your business, right? Understanding when you look at your business, what do you do, where do you do it, how do you do it, and for whom are you doing it? And the answer to those questions that's going to give you the geography, which will identify the certain governmental laws and regulations. It will identify the industry for industry regulations or government regulations that are specific to your industry that are coming out of your industry's regulatory agency or agencies. How you do it might impose rules on you for compliance. So for example, if your systems, if you're a small business, there are two ways you can handle credit card processing. One is you handle it with a partial in-house system where you're capturing the transaction in your systems and executing it, but you're actually holding on to some of that credit, personal card information as part of your system. The other way is to outsource it in a way that you never actually are in possession, even in transit, of the personal card information, right? So how you process your business will affect it. If you never touch credit card information, even to the extent that you won't take credit card payment over the phone, so your people won't be physically writing down credit card information on slips of paper and then entering it in the system on the client's behalf, then what you need to do for PCI compliance is significantly different than if you're capturing and managing that information. Or you've outsourced it, but hey, your team will still handwrite down someone's credit card information while they're on the phone or listen to it on the phone and type it in the system on their behalf, the outsourced system. You have a different level of compliance, right? Are you to consumers? Are you into consumers of specific practices? Are you selling to other businesses, government entities? Do those entities have specific security requirements? So start with the business. Also data, what is it? Do you even have personally identifiable information? And where is it used in the business? How's that data used? How are you storing it? And how's it shared? And how it's shared isn't just the mechanisms you have for sharing. It's how do you manage access and control? And how do you structure the identities of the people who have access to and track that as well? And so that's, you sort of start with your, in the beginning with your business. And then it's time to map compliance into your industry, into the regulatory agencies that oversee your industry and your business, into the legal requirements and for any jurisdiction that you're operating with as defined by the compliance itself, right? So again, My company's not located in California. We have customers in in California. For those California customers, we have to be CCPA compliant. Now, the good news is by setting up our business to be GDPR compliant, we're able to easily comply with CCPA. That becomes part of the mapping strategy. I'll get to that in a second. The one thing I want to remind folks is understand and apply best practices. There are a lot of evolving great best practices for small mid-sized businesses that can help you model, make decisions, and do so in a more cost-effective way. And so when you get into your mapping strategy, you're going to need to meet multiple compliance standards. Be ready for that. The number, again, depends on those business questions we talked about. Select a preferred reference model. Our go-to right now and recommendation for most small and mid-sized companies is SIC, unless there's a reason that you need to delve more into NIST or go the ISO 27001 route. Once you have a reference model and once you understand your compliance standards, you're going to identify the overlapping requirements, because here, you do it once and you're done across all those standards. And if you've got two similar standards, default to following the most restrictive or the most imposing, right? Go to the greatest common denominator, and you'll cover the others as well. It's actually a bit of common sense. So we are proponents of our security CPR model, 3 keystones in which you can build your cybersecurity foundation: communication, education, prevention and protection, and recovery and response. I'll walk through it really quickly here because we're heading up to the half-hour mark. Communicate and educate is all about understanding that you have to know there's a problem before you can solve it. And the realization with respect to security that human behavior is probably your greatest risk, and it certainly increases your risk. And also recognizing that no prevention or protection policies, procedures, technologies is going to be perfect. Okay, so with communicate and educate, your team needs to be aware of the risks, understand the impact, know what to look for, when to be suspicious, when to say something and how to say it, and accept that security is at times going to be a necessary inconvenience. Oh, they're grumbling about having to log into a VPN or having to do two-factor authentication, or the two-factor authentication doesn't remember them for long enough. Boo-hoo, right? It's a little bit of an inconvenience for a really good cause. And so when we talk about communicate and educate, it's your policies, it's your procedures, it's security awareness training, which includes test and verify, and potentially having more formalized security program management. Most small and mid-sized companies don't need dedicated program management resources, whether they're internal or contracted. Depends on what compliance standards you're being held to, what regulations or legal requirements you have, and the size and complexity of your business as well in your security ecosystem. Prevent and protect is, as the name, you want to, prevent attacks and breaches and violations of your compliance from happening, and you want to protect your data, your people, your customers, your vendors, your business, your data, your operations, your workflows when they do. And so we always say for small and mid-sized businesses, if you start with the most commonly used attack methods, and also go to protect and focus on the most expensive types of attacks, you're probably 85 to 90% of where you need to be from a prevent and protection standpoint. More attacks are multi-step and more complex, and so you want to be ready for those and minimize single point of failure. It's not always cost-effective or economical enough to eliminate all single points of failure in your security envelope. And your prevention and protection is going to have both passive and active measures. And so a little bit of a summary there. There are things, here's an example of things you can do to individual accounts. Multi-factor authentication that's really, really well done is important. Microsoft estimates that between 92 and 97% of all cyber attacks can be stopped from being successful if multi-factor authentication is properly in place. Encrypting data in transit at rest, advanced threat protection, endpoint protection, protecting your DNS environment and your web traffic, and having some form of managed detection response where if there's a breach that appears to be happening, there's an alert and there's someone available to respond and to help nip it in the bud, get it to stop. At the domain and business level, email protocols are key. Most cyber attacks still revolve around email at some point, if not the origin, early on or even later on in the process when it comes to business email compromise. There are things you can do to prevent those from happening, to protect yourselves if someone does get in, from actually being able to exploit their access. And business level security services. More small businesses, I wouldn't say most yet, but more small businesses are finding that having a security operations center available, which are, imagine the war room with the big screens and all the alerts coming in, having people actively watching for security alerts from your business and being able to initiate response when something happens. Respond and recover isn't just getting your data back, it's making sure you can minimize your loss, which is your data, financially for your business and your reputation, limiting your liability, both civil and criminal. Civil is the monetary damages when customers or other people sue you. And in many states right now, certain types of breaches or security events are considered criminal, and you could, and your company could face criminal prosecution as well. And you want to stay in business. Well, we know that it can take, for a small business, for a small to moderate sized breach, it can take anywhere from 7 to 18 business days to fully recover. So one, you want to be able to return to operations as quickly as possible to keep the business running, keep the cash flow happening, keeping payroll, keeping the cash available for payroll and paying your vendors. And then, it takes longer, particularly if you're investigating the breach and dealing with the insurance process, to return to normal operations. And so return to operations might require some adaptation in how you run the business in the short term until you can get your systems clean, protected, and back up and running fully. Okay, so in case of emergency and response and recover, it's about communications. Most states now and the federal government in some cases has regulatory requirements for notifications, activating your cyber insurance, getting law enforcement involved in forensics investigations when appropriate, and preparing for any litigation defense depending on the industry you're in and the level of risk there. And again, recovery is not just restoring lost or damaged data and files, working around unavailable systems until they're back online, having a quick return to operations, and then getting back to normal operations after that. And so what are your next steps? We're going to offer something free for you for attending. We'll give you a rapid security assessment. There's a URL on the screen, or you can scan the QR code. This takes a look at some of the basics we look for in small, mid-sized business security, and identify gaps and recommend solutions and provide a rough budget for those solutions. Once you've done an assessment and understand where you're at, you can define the value proposition and the cost of inaction. What's the value if I spend the money to do it? What's the potential risk or cost if I don't, as far as getting your security up to speed? At that point, you can plan your strategy, your tactics, the resources required, and the timing. And then, of course, you have to implement. And when you implement, you definitely need to manage change, because any changes to your cybersecurity or your overall security profile and footprint those changes are absolutely going to impact the way some, most, or all of your people have to do certain things on a day-to-day basis. It is visible to them. They should understand why, how, when, wherefore to it's happening, so that they're on board and they're receptive and accepting of those changes. We have many great security-related resources in our library. There's the link to the library. Go in, check out the eBooks. You can also search. We've got some great security blog posts over the last even 2 years in covering this topic in pretty much depth. And of course, feel free to reach out and call us or schedule a time. There's a QR code and a link to get an intro call with one of our cloud advisors. So I've actually gone a little bit long. We try and keep this under 30 minutes, and I'm a little bit over that right now. So if you have any questions, what I'm going to do for QA and wrap up here is contact information, email, schedule an appointment, give us a call. My contact information is there. I don't have assistants. I'm bad at answering the phone and answering voicemail, so shoot me an email. If I can't get back too quickly, I'll have a member of my team. What I will do, since we ran a little long, is I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to wrap this up so I can end the recording. But I'll come back in just a second, and if anyone has any sessions, we can do a little bit of a Q&A. And I appreciate you all hanging out for the full session here today. I hope I covered a lot of information. I hope it was valuable and provided some good insights, and look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you.